Monday night edition of the pod. We got to get to Luka Doncic, who we've been hearing so much about. Finally got a chance to really dive into the film on him. And then we'll also talk about the Memphis Grizzlies, which amazingly at 4 might potentially be a landing spot for Doncic. So the place that you have to start with him is just the absolutely unprecedented production for his age, and really at any level. I mean, for an 18-year-old, the way that he just played, there's never been any European player who's played this well as an 18-year-old. And remember, the EuroLeague, the ACB, that's a level like well beyond college basketball. He was MVP of the Final Four, MVP of the EuroLeague this season, and probably that was deserved. Kevin Pelton noting that he was second in terms of value in the EuroLeague this season based on his statistics. So I mean, you really would have to go to only a few high schoolers who were in the NBA, you know, LeBron James, those type of players. Because remember, Doncic just turned 19. He's pretty young as well. That have provided this level of production and this type of contribution to winning basketball at his age.
I want to add in one other piece of information with that, which is his success on the Slovenian national team in Eurobasket 2017, because that is competing, you know, not against full teams of NBA talent, but there are NBA players that competed in that tournament, including Kristaps Porzingis. A lot of the Spain guys were there, and Slovenia went undefeated in the kind of pool play type thing, and then they won the actual championship. And the team was built around Goran Dragic and Luka Doncic in a really interesting backcourt. I went back and watched some of the footage of that yesterday to kind of get a sense of how he would fit with another guy like Dragic.
Now, while the EuroLeague, while the ACB League, while Eurobasket is certainly a higher level of competition than NCAA, it is important to note that basically he was never guarded by an NBA quality wing defender, a 6'6" guy with length, with athleticism. I mean, if you watch the film of him, he very often was being guarded by the opposing team's point guard. He very often was playing in a point guard type of role, but did not really have to face off against like true NBA quality length. And when he did, he struggled to some degree, especially in his isolations. You know, he's not an elite athlete by any means, but still, I mean, just this level of production is extremely hard to ignore. And I wasn't sure how much I was going to like him coming in. I thought that I might be kind of have a little bit of a conflict between what my eyes would see and then just the reality of the production that he's put up in a very high level league, considering his age, and that I might have to try to resolve that conflict. But ultimately, what I saw in film was good enough that I'm not really that much of a doubter. How do you feel?
I think it depends on how you're defining terms. I have confidence that he is an NBA player. I do not have confidence that he is like an NBA superstar. And that is a real rarefied air. So how you define those terms, you know, like as the number one pick, a lot of people would say, you know, if he's in the conversation there, that you need somebody who can, you know, realistically be an all NBA type guy. And I think that might be a little bit much for him, but I think he has a high floor. And I think that he has a relatively high ceiling. My big question with Doncic is the ability to create separation at the next level. There are players, especially with his size. This is very different from like a 6'1" guy who can't create separation, because Doncic is like 6'8". And it's also weird that like I don't think I've never seen a wingspan measurement for him. He's been in the mix for such a long time, but he's already been on teams. So they don't really do like, you know, like Kentucky does that like media day type thing where they measure.
I looked for it. I couldn't
Real
find
Madrid
anything.
does not do that. Yeah, it's super weird. And he's still playing, so he wasn't at the combine. And so my read on him is kind of the what if the main thing doesn't work? And I still think he's a valuable NBA player there. I think kind of the comparison, I've had trouble thinking of an analog for what the non-peak Luka Doncic is, but it's kind of like a better version of Evan Fournier is about where I was, where it's like he can't necessarily run an offense, but he can help an offense work better, makes good decisions. And I think Doncic is way better than his ceiling is way higher than Fournier. But the thing that I really like about Doncic, this was actually the first note I ever made on him, and then I kept on coming back to it, is that he plays like he gives a shit. And that is a very, very good thing, especially for a guy as young as he is. And that comes in especially on offense and transition. If he he goes in for rebounds. He actually tries for rebounds. He can push the pace. He can grab and go, and he makes good decisions. If he doesn't have the ball, he still makes his way down the floor, can either spot up at the three-point line or go into the basket, depending on what the situation presents itself. And that is a massive positive for a guy who isn't the best athlete to be intelligent as he is and to have a good motor. And he does that too.
Yeah, I don't know how good his motor is defensively, but yeah, the defensive
yeah, that's true.
The defensive rebound rate is impressive. 20% defensive rebounds is pretty good, to be sure, and that certainly helps him as a grab and go guy. All right, we got a ton more detail to get into. I'm going to talk about why I actually seem to be higher on him than you. It's been interesting. We haven't discussed these prospects at all before we start doing it. I think that actually makes for more interesting radio. But first, I want to discuss movement watches. You've heard me talk about them all the time. Actually, my fiance came to me the other day and was like, had a chilling confession that she had actually lost her movement watch that I got her, and so now she is really missing it and wants to get another one immediately. So that was a tough admission for her, I guess. But they really are fantastically stylish watches. Go to movement.com, mvmt.com/capspace. That would be what I'd encourage you to do. And just look at all their styles. They've actually now doubled the number of styles that they have. They've also expanded to sunglasses and also bracelets for women. They've come a long way from being just a couple of crowd-funded kids working out of a living room. They've sold almost 2 million watches now in 160 countries, which means if you're an international listener, a lot of our products, it's tough for you to support the pod, but they certainly will ship pretty much anywhere at this point. My favorite is their 40 series. I like a little bit smaller of a watch, but generally just the styled minimalism that they have. Again, just go to that movement.com/capspace URL. A, you get 15% off, but B, you just scroll through there and see if there's anything that you like. Graduation time right now, Father's Day right about now, and movement watches come in at the perfect price point for a gift. You know, it's not a $400 or $500 watch, even though they look like them. They start at just $95. Remember, you're getting that 15% off with free shipping as well if you use that /capspace URL. So once again, the way to get started with them, movement.com, mvmt.com/capspace. Easy to remember /capspace. We talk about all the time here on the program. And let them know at that /capspace URL that you came from us. So let me talk about why I was so impressed with him, given his athletic limitations, which generally, when a ball handler has this type of athletic limitations, that's a red flag. He's 6'8", which really helps a lot, and 230. As you mentioned, probably has like an average wingspan. The height is so important for him. This is something we've been talking about with some of these other prospects, that especially now with that pass to the weak side for a three-point shot becoming so important out of pick and roll, he's got the height to throw that, you know, in contrast to maybe Trae Young, who's got to loop that up. He can throw that pass from a higher release point over the defense on a line, get it there quickly without it getting deflected. That is huge. He is just a beautiful pick and roll operator, and really, at this age, right up there with, he might even be the most skilled 6'8" guy at this age that I've ever seen. Whether it's his step back jumpers, which he didn't shoot a crazy good percentage on, but he's taking some very difficult attempts. His handle for a 6'8" guy, in terms of how advanced it is, his ability to change speeds behind the back, between the legs, crossovers, get the guy in his back in pick and roll, really just has tons of moves. Now he's vulnerable to pressure full court in terms of his handle and just his speed, and he can kind of just get slowed down that way. He'll have to put his back to goal sometimes as he's bringing the ball up. But I mean, I can't think of another 6'8". I mean, and he's 6'8". You know, if you would have to go to like a Kobe Bryant at this age to find a guy who I think had the type of skill level off the dribble this young that he does. Now, he doesn't have anywhere near that kind of rise or anywhere near that kind of quickness, of course. But I think that that's really one of the most impressive things about him. He's got post-game floaters, ability to get into the lane and Euro step, slow down, get his shot off in the lane. Even if he's not an amazing finisher, he can create angles, kind of slow the defense down so they can't really get a good angle to jump. That's what really sticks up to me, is just how skilled he is at this age. And now, you know, that all of that stuff can use some more refinement, you know, especially with just the ball going in on a lot of his shots. But he's able to create pretty decent looks, at least against the quality competition that he's going against, which is, you know, the second best competition in the world.
I think a good reflection of that skill level is the hook pass that he already throws at 18, now 19 years old, is really, really impressive. And it totally works with his height and the velocity on it, if he can read the play correctly, which he usually does, it's really nice. Like, it gets to the guy in the corner fast. It's something I talk about a lot with LeBron, and Doncic is not at that level of a passer, but he's very, very good. And so he can see the guy open and he can get the ball there quickly. And we talked about this with Trae Young a couple days ago, that he has to throw a looping pass because those are the angles that are available to him. Doncic does not have those limitations. And I think the big question that I want to ask you, because it seems like you are higher on him, as you mentioned before, one of the big determining factors for Doncic, whether or not he is, a high-end offensive player, will depend on his jump shot, both on catch and shoot and off the dribble. He relied a lot on the step back, a lot of his isolations end in step backs, and they went in, a reasonable proportion of the time. Doncic ended, the last 2 years he's been about 80% free throw shooter, low 30s on threes in league play. So it's obviously further back at the NBA line. How do you see that moving forward? Do you think that time and experience and refinement will improve that more than moving back will affect it?
Well, he's not that far back. Remember, he's at the 22-foot international line, and he also is very comfortable taking threes that are deeper than right at the line, and even step backs that are beyond the international three-point line. And again, let's remember, he just turned 19 here, 1999, February of 1999, his birthday. So to be able to shoot as well as he can on as difficult of attempts at this age, very, very impressive. Now, there is kind of a volume-esque feel to him. Do you see him being a 40% three-point shooter off the dribble? Maybe not. He's not like that 85%, 90% free throw shooter that you might expect that from. Again, very difficult attempts, but as a spot-up guy, he's actually no better really as a spot-up guy, no better really in relatively low number of attempts, even on wide-open spot-ups, than he is on these tough off-the-dribble attempts. I expect him to get better, but, you could see him being 36, 37% ultimately. He doesn't quite strike me as like that 40% type of player, but, to shoot 36, 37% on this type of attempts, and it's tough to know, too, because, given the level that he's playing at and the way that he plays, you almost you just forget how young he is and you just start translating exactly what he is now into the NBA, because he looks so fully formed and is so skilled already. And that's one of the big questions is does the fact that he has this skill level already and he's not that athletic, does that mean that he's closer to his ceiling than other players? Or do you just say, hey, he's already doing this at 18, the sky could absolutely be the limit for this guy? I'm not sure which way to go, but generally, young guys tend to improve, and your production at a young age usually ends up translating and improving over the years. So I don't know the answer to that question, but his form looks good. He's just very comfortable. He's very skilled. The question I have for you is, do you believe that he can improve his athleticism? He doesn't have, European teams are not renowned for their training. He's going to be spending a lot of time, playing in the summers with his national team, which may not help him very much in terms of really working on his body, working on his game in the offseason. He doesn't really have much definition now. Can he cut up? Can he get a little bit more athletic? I think that would help him so much if he could get there. It's just, that's really tough to say. But I do think that pro training could help him some.
I think he can as well. It's actually something John Gavoni brought up.
And I shouldn't say
on
pro, by the way.
Radio
Obviously, he's a pro. I should say NBA.
Yeah, NBA training camp. And he's also playing a ton of games right now because of the combination of Real Madrid stuff plus the Slovenia work. He's playing in a lot of games. This is not college guys going twice a week and everything and balancing schoolwork and everything. I think that he will be used to the workload, and so maybe then you can spend a little bit more time in the gym and getting used to it. I think stamina is another thing that could help him
this year.
It's crazy.
For Real Madrid.
So if he can give max effort over fewer minutes a game, I think that could be interesting with him. I do think a little bit more burst. I could see that being there, and also just kind of that. You talked about his handle, fluidity, speed with the ball, just getting more comfortable making reads on the fly and everything like that. He's good at those things for a player his age, to be sure. But the NBA ratchets that up because of the perimeter athleticism, the windows for passes, the windows for getting by a guy are much smaller than they are at international levels, even as good as the ACB is. So I think that he has the capacity to get better. It might take more time than it would for some other guys just because he doesn't really get those summers off. And I mean, maybe he ends up on a team that's bad enough where he gets April and May off, and that can really help. Or May, June, whatever. But I do think that he has some capacity there. And another thing I wanted to bring up with the jump shot is that I like his mechanics when he is more in the catch and shoot role. So synergy, 1.1 points per possession on spot ups, 1.3 off screens, though that's only 50 possessions, which is not very much. And when I watch him in those circumstances, it's like, okay, this is a guy who knows what he's doing. I don't think he's going to be that necessarily, like a knockdown type guy, but that you have to guard him. And if you have to guard him / close out, then you're creating opportunities when he's off the ball because he can attack those closeouts incredibly well. I mean, if his role is more being a secondary creator, I think that he has the skill set for that right away. It's different than, and he's so much more developed than like Frank Ntilikina, where I had this idea of like, if he can't be a point guard, what is the value that he's going to provide? And the difference between those guys on defense is night and day. We'll talk about that. But I like what he can be, even if the best case scenario offensively, even if the best case scenario doesn't work out because of those skill sets and also because of his height. And so a question that I've been grappling with Doncic for a long time now is, how big of a priority is he going to be for the opposing defense? And a lot of this will be surrounding talent as well. But like, let's say he gets drafted by the Suns, or he gets drafted, you could go through any team. Is Doncic a good enough offensive player where he's going to get the other team's best defender? And if he is, I think Doncic, there will be some real challenges for him there, just because the athleticism, the wingspan, the length, everything can be a big problem. But that brings a lot of other positives for the remainder of his teammates, because if that player has to be on Doncic, then that player is not on anyone else.
Well, I think drafting him in the range that we're talking about, the hope is that he could be a number one guy. And to me, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I would want to use him, which you started to touch on there. I would just play him as the point guard. I think that's the best way to get the most out of him. And then he's going to be a defensive liability. But if you're playing him with a regular point guard, and now you also have to play him at the 2 or the 3, that's probably going to be a rough defensive perimeter rotation, right? So if you play him at the 1, yeah, he might struggle a little bit against pressure, but my hope is that he'll be big enough to take advantage of guys like that in the post. He's already showing a nice post game, so that teams would end up putting more length on him. And then, you can put, much like with Ben Simmons, I mean, he's not the defensive player that Simmons is. I'm not expecting him to be this great switch guy, but at least you can get just a normal 2 and a normal 3 on the floor next to him and just get more overall size and length on the floor, because he's that good of a ball handler, and he'll push the ball in transition. He could stand to do even more of that, I think, really running it down the other team's throats. But that's the way I would play him. Because then, I guess he would have to play the 2, and now you have to get a wing next to him and a point guard. And he's best with the ball in his hands. I think he can play off ball. But that's what I would like to do if you can get the personnel around him. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Well, and the nice thing about using Doncic there is that there are a bunch of 6'4", 6'5" guys that are capable with the ball in their hands, but you don't necessarily want them to be the number one option. Like, I was thinking about, I think Donovan Mitchell will eventually be much better than this, but like they're Donovan Mitchell, if Victor Oladipo before this past season, maybe even Devin Booker. I need to watch a little bit more of Devin Booker with the ball in his hands to see where I want him there. Talked about that a little bit yesterday, but there are guys like that. And so then you're a little bit on the small side to switch, but I think they could make that work, and getting that complementary piece, or even, I think that you can make that work. And I agree with you that if you're looking for a high ceiling team, the best way to use Doncic is as the primary ball handler, because then it opens up these other niches for other players. And I think that you can be flexible enough with him that maybe you have a capable point guard who comes off the bench, like maybe a Fred VanVleet type. And so those two guys can change it over. They can go through different circumstances. So you don't necessarily play him at the 1 all the time, but you play him at the 1 a lot.
Now, I think that the biggest concern for me is his ability to beat switches. But that's a big concern for 98% of the NBA, basically. And if you are forced to play conventional pick and roll defense against him, I mean, I think he's going to carve that up. I'm not that worried about the idea of like, oh, we're putting so much length on this guy, because he could just use a screen to get that off him, right? I mean, like Steve Nash wasn't some incredibly quick guy, but he could just use a screen. He knows how to set up a screen. He's got a good enough handle to do that. And then he can get the guy off him a little bit, and he's going downhill and you have to react to him. So that I think is, I'm not that worried about that. Now, if you can switch those screens, what's the antidote to that? Well, maybe that antidote for him would be, I'm 6'8", 230, so if you're switching everything, we're going to go find the smallest guy in the other team, get him involved, and now I can back down into the post. And his post game was, not amazing statistically. He was 44 points on 52 possessions, so under a point per possession, but most post-ups are going to be like that. He's got pretty decent power game. He likes, whichever block he's on, he usually likes to spin baseline. He's got like over his left shoulder, he's got a little like half hook floater type of play. He's also got fadeaway jumpers over either shoulder if he wants to go there. Or I even saw him go to like a Dirk step back. So his skill level is going to be good enough. I expect him to be a solid player in the post, assuming that teams want to go to that when he has a smaller player on him. I think that could be pretty effective. Get into a few. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, something other one I wanted to bring up. So when I watched him, I thought Doncic was better when he had a size mismatch. I thought that he was better attacking bigs than smaller guys.
Well, facing
because he could use his step facing the basket. Yes. And so it'll be interesting if you use him as a primary ball handler, who you want to get in the actions with him. And NBA bigs are different, As much as I enjoyed watching him play with Gustavo Ayon, there will not be many bigs like Gustavo Ayon that he will face in the NBA.
And actually, his situation overall at Real Madrid, they played him a little bit at the 4. I don't think he'll be able to do that in the NBA. He can rebound, but he's just, unless you really have a lot more length, and then that guy probably would technically be the on the wing, he would be kind of further down in the spectrum compared to just most modern NBA wings, a Trevor Ariza type. You would think of Trevor Ariza as playing the 4 rather than him. He can rebound, so I think he can help out in small ball lineups there. But in terms of protecting the rim, in terms of being able to defend in the post, that's not really going to work for him at all. His block rate was pathetically bad for a 6'8" guy, 4% block rate. Right.
So what I was getting at with that was the idea. So let's say a team, an opponent puts their shooting guard on Doncic, and you run then will be a 2-5 pick and roll. I think you could create mismatches both ways, which I think would be interesting. So the old thing of the Nurkic, Jokic idea of attacking the mismatch right away. But then Doncic, I think, could dance around a little bit on the perimeter and get that guy uneasy. And that's something that I'm really looking for as kind of the next stage of attacking pick and roll switches, is where you can go in either spot. And that makes it harder to necessarily game plan for it. So I'm intrigued by some of the tactical elements of using him, because the difference between Doncic and Ben Simmons at that facet is that Doncic is both a competent and a confident shooter. And so the way he attacks is very different from the way Simmons attacks or the way LeBron attacks, because LeBron is so much more of a physical force.
I would love to see him in transition have even more of a quick trigger from deep, because I think he has that shot in his arsenal to really like force guys to get out on the floor and defend him. And in transition, usually would go right to the basket in those situations. 84th percentile in transition, which is pretty good when you're the ball handler most of the time. 94 of his possessions were as the ball handler. He definitely doesn't really run the floor very well when he doesn't have the ball, because he's kind of just going back to get it. But only 1 possession per game. That's not amazing. And as mentioned, that 20.6% defensive rebounding does help him be a grab and go guy. And we talked about in the NBA how when you're the transition ball handler, usually you're the one who gets all the turnovers in transition, which means that your points per possession is usually going to be lower. That to be 84th percentile when you are the ball handler all the time is pretty good. Usually, if you're the ball handler, you're going to have an ugly point per possession, and then the guys that you throw it to on passes are going to, they're just finishing the play, so it looks a lot better for them in terms of their statistics. A few other stats I really wanted to get to. We mentioned the 70 games, 59.5% true shooting. That's outstanding work considering the 27% usage, considering the age. 4.6 assists per game. Remember, they are stingier with assists in European scoring, and that's in only 25 minutes per game as well. 79% from the line. You said he's around 80% from his career. And then only 31% from three this year, takes about 50% of his shots from downtown. Now, this is something that Gavoni and Pelton discussed extensively in a Q&A about him, which I recommend you read. He had almost a 50% free throw rate, which is awesome. That's like among the best guys in the NBA. Now, the suggestion was made by Gavoni, that talking to a lot of his European contacts, that he gets like a ton of superstar calls, James Harden type of calls. KP noted that you generally see a 30% reduction in foul rate when you translate stats from the EuroLeague to the US. And one thing I was reminded of watching the EuroLeague Final Four is in Europe, so many touch fouls are called on the perimeter, especially because teams are always in the bonus so early. Those can result in free throws. And when he has the ball in his hands all the time. And then also worth noting, he got fouled 173 times leading to free throws. So it's about 340 free throws this year. 55 out of those 173 are fouls that are kind of like not really earned fouls, right? So 39 of those were just characterized as no play type, meaning it was some kind of a loose ball foul or just some kind of foul, touch foul out in the perimeter, really before anything happened in the play. You know, it's not like he was really blowing by the guy and he had no choice to foul him. And then he also got fouled on 16 Euro fouls in transition. So basically take away 110 free throws that aren't really earned in any particular way. Now, any player is going to have a reasonable number of those, but compared to Europe and even to NCAA basketball also, it's just harder to get fouls in the NBA. And so that crazy free throw rate, I don't know how much of that translates because, you know, I think he's going to get better at just kind of drawing fouls. You know, there weren't a lot of those like call-seeking behavior, drawn fouls. A lot of transition, you know, getting to the rim, he could get foul calls when he was pushing it. But again, you know, against NBA athleticism, they may not need to foul him in that situation. There weren't that many fouls where he's just like really getting the advantage, blowing by the guy and like creating the contact, kind of the way we would think about for NBA fouls, or where he's just, you know, using his smarts to get fouled. So I think that is a legitimate concern that he's not going to be able to get to the foul line as much. And if he can't now, especially with that 3-point shooting, you start to wonder like, all right, now he's got to get up to 36, 37% from three, or he's going to struggle to be efficient.
And you touched on something just now, which I think is important to note with Doncic, that he doesn't really shake guys his own size very often. His best kind of like ankle breakers are almost all against 6'10" and taller guys. Yeah. And that's a very different challenge than trying to shake a 6'7" dude, or even, you know, like a point guard, because they've seen all that stuff before. And again, that's there are different ways to create separation. You can do it through size, you can do it through speed, you can do it through moves like Kyrie does. But that is a concern because if he'll have to get a lot better there, because even if it's just a tool in his toolbox and not like the centerpiece of his offensive value, it's still important.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, his ability to get to his step back is really impressive. And just the way, while he is not blowing by guys, he plays at such a nice pace that he's always got a little bit more in the tank to go a little bit faster than he is going. And in terms of changing speeds, also changing direction, you know, he's got just a really nice between the legs dribble. He can use his body, use his shoulder to create space for the jump shot. Just he is very cognizant of being able to just get a guy going one way and then cross over maybe even multiple times, just using someone's momentum against them. You know, I've even seen him make plays where he'll drive all the way to the free throw line, be covered, and then take two dribbles back all the way to the 3-point line and take a three. On basically like a double step back, dribbling backwards. You know, that's not a move that you see very often. I mean, he's got a lot of really nice moves, which, you know, he's going to need those obviously to create the separation, but especially if he can get just a little, like tighten those up just a little bit more, the creativity is there, and then to also get just a little bit more athletic. And I think he'll be able to get by. Now, is he getting to the rim, you know, in isolation? No, not really. I mean, here's some more stats on that. 0.79 points per possession. That's only 44th percentile. You know, so that's a little bit below average. We noted that he's very reliant on the step back. And so some stats in that. He'll go in an ISO. A third of the time he goes left, third of the time he goes right. Now, either of those could still result in the step back. And then a third of the time he basically takes the jumper without really trying to drive at all. So on 93 ISOs up top, he got to the rim only 17 times, and then 6 more of those were runners. So he's really only getting penetration, you know, about 20% of the time on his drives, a little bit more than that. So let's say to compare that to James Harden, another guy who, you know, is not the absolute quickest guy, certainly quicker than Doncic, doesn't quite have the height of Doncic, but I think it's an interesting comparison to him as a guy who has the ball in his hands, likes to change speeds a lot, more more kind of reliant on craft, although, his physicality and strength is well beyond Doncic as well. For Harden, I mentioned with Doncic, about a little over 20% of the time he's driving. For top ISOs for James Harden, who had 434 top ISOs this year, 191 of those times, so that's more like 40% of the time, he's either driving or taking a floater. So that's a big difference between what Doncic is doing. And certainly it'll be easier for him to drive with NBA spacing if he's on the right team. He's playing with two bigs a lot of the time at Real Madrid when he wasn't playing the four. I think I'd be very interested to see, if when he's fully formed, he's really able to create against switch defenders who are kind of, maybe it's not against Clint Capella, but, if he's against a Steven Adams type of center switched out on him, is he going to be able to create a good look against kind of, your slightly above average foot speed starting center, that type of player? I'd be very interested to see that. And then, if he does get penetration, can he finish at the rim? That's another thing we can talk about too.
Yeah, we might as well go there now. He was about 60% at the rim this year. And what I like about Doncic is that I don't necessarily love his touch with either hand, but he's capable with both hands, and a lot of young guards can't do that. And
yeah, I mentioned this briefly, that he gets shots that actually look pretty good, but sometimes they just don't go in. I think he just hasn't quite refined his touch, but he's able to get the shot off in a way that makes you think, all right, if he just improves his touch a little bit, this will go in.
Yeah, I have some confidence there, and I also like that he generally has an idea of where he wants to go with it when he gets the rim. Does he want to do a lefty off the glass? Which way does he want to go? And some guys have real trouble with that. It's kind of like they're playing a fighting game and they're picking the wrong fighting move each time because they just haven't gotten used to it. And I think that will bode well for where Doncic becomes in the future, because I think he has good judgment in those circumstances from what I've seen so far, though the quality of the contest and the athleticism is going to spike significantly for him, even over what he saw both in the EuroLeague and in the Eurobasket last year.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about his finishing at the rim. Not really going to turn it over for a dunk. He had a couple of dunks this season, but, it was kind of just, he had a path. He's not going to go over anybody's contest for a dunk generally. Not really much of a 2-foot jumper either. Likes shooting off a one much more. He'll miss some bunnies off a 2 foot a lot of times, especially. He never really He'll shoot with his left hand when he's driving to the rim off a 1 foot sometimes. Still could definitely stand to improve that. And then when he's off a 2 feet under the rim, going for a 2-foot power move, never shoots it with his left hand, and he'll miss a lot with his right. He could definitely stand to shoot with his left more in those situations. The craft is nice. He's got that one hand Nash layup with 1 or 2 feet. We've seen Donovan Mitchell do that too. I saw a couple of attempts for him on kind of Donovan Mitchell-esque 2-foot finishes where he really got good extension for a scoop shot. The other thing that I like is because he's so under control that he's able to kind of slow down Joe Ingles style. And Joe Ingles is actually a surprisingly solid finisher despite his complete lack of a right hand, to let the defense fly by or just slow down enough that, the guy can't really load up and jump. He's got to, if you're trying to time him and you quick jump, he can slow it down and let you fly by. And so if you have to kind of wait him out as he slows down, as a big, you're not going to be able to jump nearly as high that way. He definitely had some times where some of the more athletic shot blockers could make him look really bad, coming over from the weak side and just erasing him. But I thought overall his skill level looked pretty good. He's not as athletic as Gordon Hayward, but I think some of his finishes kind of reminded of Gordon Hayward a little bit too, just that very slow Euro step type of plays, pump fakes. He also will, as he's going to the rim, use a pass fake to freeze the defense so he can get his shot off. That'll work pretty well. Not really a threat to go get an alley-oop, though. The way someone like Hayward is, he's significantly less athletic than where Gordon Hayward is at this point in time, and even as a college player. So, if you're going to send him backdoor on alley-oops, that's probably not going to work, unless he, again, significantly improves his athleticism. But I think he could be good enough as a finisher, again, because he shows so much creativity in all parts of his game that you have, or I don't know if you have, but I have faith that he can figure it out even against more athletic players ultimately.
I do have faith that he can do that. And remember, not only is he playing against men, but he's playing against seasoned professionals. They have limitations often in terms of athleticism, but think the craft in terms of finishing in in college and finishing in the ACB are two very different things. And I've been very impressed with the way that he keeps on adding and keeps on getting better. And like when I would notice differences with him when I was, even within it, you could be like, okay, look, this is a little bit different moving on. And I watching the EuroLeague Final Four, I saw more from him in some of those areas than I liked. Where I wanted to go next is him as a passer. And I don't think Doncic has this like elite court vision compared to the truly elite. Like I said, he's not a LeBron level passer for me or Ben Simmons level passer, even though he has better height than point guards. But what I do love about Doncic, and this is overall in his game too, is that he has a really intriguing feel for the game. So like one of my favorite passes that he throws is something that you almost never see in the NBA, where he throws these kind of timing passes on the baseline to a big man, where he kind of knows when the big man's going to get to his spot, and he throws a pass there. It's very hard to steal. Sometimes it could get knocked away and become an inbound, and you can only really do that if you have a really good sense for where all the little chess pieces are moving. And those sorts of plays, some of the passes he throws in transition, they're more kind of like basketball IQ feel plays than court vision plays, but that's a really good sign.
Yeah, and at his size, maybe it's not quite Ben Simmons, maybe it's not quite LeBron, but it's not that far below that, I don't think. And to the extent that, maybe he just, isn't able to attack the defense with the same type of speed to draw help and open up those windows. But it's pretty rare that I'd see him miss a pass. And I remember one of the games I watched was when they played at Baskonia and won. He was doing nothing on the defensive end that whole time, but then basically pick and roll every single time, just diming guys up. They're running a lot of Spain pick and rolls, like finding shooters on the weak side, finding the roll man. It really was just carving them up every single time. It really looked awesome. Baskonia was the second best team in the ACB this year. So it's, especially considering his age, it's really impressive where he's at it. And I think, he does a good job of picking up his dribble at the right time. Any kind of miscommunication in the defense as far as like, are they going to switch or are they going to bring the big up to the level of the ball? He's able to find like very creative passing angles to get the roll guy slipping to the rim.
Or guys leaning. Yeah. That's one that I really like with him, where like a player is trying to figure out where he wants to go and he has a 3-point shooter and he just hits them before the guy makes a decision. And that's such a key pass in the NBA.
Yeah, Harden, LeBron, those are the two guys who will throw those passes in the NBA as well. What do you think the chances are he can be a 20-point a game scorer?
I think that's higher. It's higher than 50. It would be above a 50% outcome for me with him. Yeah. So maybe like a 30%, something like that. But I could see him being a high usage guy that it doesn't always convert into his own shot.
Yeah, I definitely think that he has some bust potential. And we've seen this with a lot of European guys, no one with the level of production at his age that we've seen, and also not with the shooting that we've seen, right? I mean, a lot of these guys who are kind of 6'6", point guard types in Europe. I mean, there are a few of those, but they're not the type of shooter that Doncic. I think that's one of the biggest differences. Your Satoranskis, your Zoran Planinic, even Papaloukas, who I would have been absolutely fascinated to see what he looked like in the NBA. But, Papaloukas wasn't really much of a shooter. And so Doncic has the pick and roll ability that those guys do, maybe even better in some cases. But he also has that jump shot off the dribble that those guys didn't have. So I think that's a big reason why he can succeed. And then, I think the potential that he has working off the ball, you mentioned those great numbers coming off a screen, 65 points on 50 possessions. I think he can get there. He's got to tighten up his footwork off the ball, work on his spot up shooting to some degree. When I say he has bust potential, though, once you get to the point where you're not having the ball in his hands, then his defensive limitations become a problem. And if he's just going to play at the 2 or the 3, he's not going to be able to really guard his position particularly well. And it becomes kind of difficult to say, if we're not going to give him the ball every time, all right, we got this guy who's like a spot up shooter and he can drive on a closeout and make decisions and be a secondary pick and roll handler. But, I thought the Evan Fournier comparison was an interesting one as far as, and Fournier is probably more athletic than Doncic is. Doncic has a bigger, stronger body, a little taller. But I thought that was interesting as kind of a lower end outcome for him.
Should we talk about his defense a little bit more?
I fear we must.
Well, so I think that, and you might remember this or know it better than I do, what was hard for me to reconcile was how much of his kind of apathy / standing around was the scheme not necessarily the scheme saying stand around and don't try, but the scheme basically saying just keep this guy in a certain area, and however you do it, it doesn't really matter. And how much of it was him just not really applying himself. And so I think he can get better, but I don't think that it would surprise me if he got to like good. I think he could be average, but good or above average will be tough.
And he only had to defend 18 isolations this year, gave up 14 points on those. Not really enough stats to draw any conclusions. But European teams don't usually play that way of going for isolations. And he's going to get cooked when teams hunt him. And we're seeing that becoming, of course, more and more of an issue. And both for that reason and then also some of the issues of him beating switches, I could see him being another one of these guys who's much more effective against the teams in the NBA that can't really switch, when he's playing pick and roll defense. And then also you could see him maybe as teams are going to play him. I know we're getting away from the defense here. This occurred to me. He could be one of these guys too, where you say, okay, we're going to just play this guy conventional pick and roll defense. I don't think he's a good enough finisher to finish it through. We're just going to play it 2-on-2. We're going to go over the screen, force him to drive. He does have a good floater game. That's something that we didn't get a chance to talk about too much, but he's solid shooting on floaters, especially when he gets the guy behind him in pick and roll. So I think that's a shot that he's really going to need, because he's not going to just go into NBA big men generally and finish against verticality. A lot of it's going to have to be trying to just get the guy off balance a little bit with some of his Euro steps and stuff. But generally, I think, especially against the best big man defenders, and if he doesn't have a great roll guy, that he could be vulnerable to playing the pick and roll 2-on-2, or of course just getting switched against some of the best switch teams, and then getting cooked defensively. I mentioned the 0.4 blocks per game, steals, a little anticipation, but he's not like some great steals guy. You don't see him step in and like take charges. He is, I didn't see him just making like mental errors that much, but just kind of standing there, not, spending 95% of the possession, not in a stance, not getting through screens, either on or off ball. They generally hit him on whoever they could get away with, and that works a lot better in Europe. So I'm very skeptical. He's not going to be able to protect the rim at all. Had some pretty hopeless give-ups guarding in the post on switches. I would be hard-pressed to find anything that he does well defensively, other than maybe just like not have ridiculously bad errors in execution.
Yeah, and I could imagine him, but of course you can massage this and attack it in other ways, being kind of the other guy in the system. So if he's I'm trying to think of the analogy here in the Sixers system. Maybe he's their Redick defensively, where he just kind of, you never want him to guard the main guy, but you just kind of have him try to avoid those ISOs.
Yeah,
but that's really hard to pull off.
Redick will at least run though. I don't see Dunc'd really being doing like chasing guys around screens very well either. But yeah, I mean he's gonna either have to do that. He's not really equipped to crash into the lane on the backside of a pick and roll and then close out. I mean, his effort level is going to have to get a lot better, and then laterally too. I mean, he really just is not able to stay in front of guys particularly well. So I mean, he's a smart player. I think he can execute. Maybe along the lines of like a Kyle Korver, or a younger Korver maybe, or someone like that. And he does rebound at least, but he also has the potential to be one of the worst defensive players in the NBA.
Yeah, there are times when I was thinking about Kyle Anderson watching Doncic, but then I remember Anderson has a pretty good wingspan for his height.
He has a ridiculous span. It's like 7'4".
And so that's a massive difference between those two guys, and gives Anderson a greater functionality defending fours, let's say. But just having that, because the quickness, you can negate some of the quickness disadvantage with that length.
Yeah, and he's 18 for most of this year, just turned 19, has a huge offensive role. I mean, he executed well enough to be on the court for a high-level European team. We've seen a lot of players have not been able to do that, but I definitely am concerned about where he's going to fit in defensively. Certainly even the chances of him getting an average, the effort can certainly improve, the intensity can certainly improve, the technique can improve. I expect all that to happen to some degree. Although, if he goes to a bad team and he's got the ball in his hands all the time, and they don't really have any kind of accountability to, maybe Memphis will be good enough to where they can have more accountability for him, although, I'm not a huge believer in their coaching staff at the moment. So I don't know. I think it could end up being a problem for sure.
So would you say, because I would, that Doncic has a higher bust potential than Ayton?
Yeah, I guess so. but I like him better than Ayton. I mean, it's really, no one has just like, that we've seen has absolutely blown me away as like, oh man, this guy is just such an awesome number one pick. And Doncic to me, like, could get to that point. I mean, there are things, many things about him that just pop off the screen as like, wow, this is awesome. Now, certainly there are the athletic limitations, but that's really it. You know, I mean, that's the only weakness that I see for him at this point. And I think when you throw in the fact that, like, I've seen enough from him on film and he's got just like a magic skill level, not Magic Johnson, and the sheer amount of stuff that he's already been able to incorporate into his game, like the fact that, like, you know, I was like, oh, this guy's going to post up. Like he actually has got like all these skilled post moves. Like, he's 18 years old. Like, when the hell did he ever have a chance to develop that? You know, like, it's just, you see some of the stuff that he does.
And not only is he 18, he's been playing competitive basketball against men for a long time now too. Like, this is because he was in Real Madrid system since he was 14, if memory serves.
Yeah. So
I wanted to end this on a kind of a philosophical thing for me, and I'm still grappling a little bit with Doncic versus Ayton. But if I think about where the league is going for the next 5 to 10 years, there are minimum thresholds in both things, to be sure, and that could end up being a problem for him over Ayton. If I had to make a bet, I would say that the league is tilting more towards smart, skilled players than athletic players, especially when you consider the positional difference between these two guys. If you look at who was able to stay on the floor and who was not able to stay on the floor in, let's say, not even just the last 2 rounds of the playoffs, but let's go with the last 3 or even all 4. Guys like, and granted, like, this is old Iguodala, not young Iguodala, but like older Andre Iguodala or Sean Livingston, those types of guys stayed on the floor, but a lot of the centers didn't. And I think that is kind of, it goes in that line of, and Doncic, with all that he's done at this age, the idea that I think that neither one of them is a lockdown bet. This is nothing to me like Towns or Anthony Davis or LeBron, obviously.
Well, or
I
even
don't think there's anybody.
Embarrassingly enough, Markelle Fultz last year. You know, I mean, I thought Fultz was on that level.
If we separate out like him as a prospect, as we thought about him in mid-June, I would agree with you. But if I had to kind of choose based on the arc of the league where I think this is headed, I think Doncic is a better fit for it than Ayton is.
I agree with that. I do wonder, I think the lack of athleticism, you know, I'm not quite sure how tough he's going to be. The fact that you can really go at him, the defense, I do think that those things could ultimately limit him if you really get to the highest levels of competition in the NBA. If we're really talking about being, you know, a number 1 guy, number 2 guy on a championship team. But, you know, it's really hard to say that about so many guys in the draft at this point in time. And I think I would definitely have him over Ayton. I'm guessing at this point, you know, unless I'm just wowed by Jaren Jackson or Wendell Carter, that he would probably be number 1 on my board. And it's just like the statistical dominance is just, it's too hard to ignore for me and the level of production at this point. One other thing we probably should note is that you do hear some things, there have been some reports that he can get really easily frustrated, that he's got a little bit of that kind of traditional Balkan hot-headedness to him. So I don't know how much to put in that. Again, we always struggle with this. You know, there's these same reports about Dennis Smith maybe not being, you know, the greatest from a character standpoint from NC State or whatever. Like, yeah, I'm generally doing these scouting reports based on what is put on film. So I'm not really considering that yay or nay in my evaluation, but is something that perhaps should be.
Sure.
All right. Well, that was really exciting. Now let's talk about the Grizzlies offseason right after this from our friends at SeatGeek, who can help you get tickets to see any of these draft prospects. Why should you use SeatGeek instead of someone else? Well, saves you time and saves you money. Two of the more important commodities in our lives these days. They aggregate ticket selling sites together, so you don't have to go to 8 sites and then, I'm going to look at the 9th one now because I'm not quite sure. I was totally that way, of course, back when, before the SeatGeek days, when you had to go to a bunch of different sites. And then they also rank every ticket based on value. So you look at the section you want to sit in, find that big green dot, the darker green, the better. You'll start to experience just endorphins when you see that green dot and know that you're getting an awesome deal on the ticket. I used SeatGeek to go to a Bucks Wizards game, got awesome seats there for my fiance and me. And not only sporting events, but also concerts, comedy, every type of live event that has a ticket with Father's Day around the corner, tickets to something could be a perfect gift as well. So the way to get started with them, download the SeatGeek app and enter that familiar promo code CAPSPACE. We're about to talk about the Memphis Grizzlies' lack of cap space, but you can get some more cap space in your wallet by using that code to get $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. That's promo code CAPSPACE for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. Let them know that you came from us. All right, where are these dudes?
I think where I want to start with Memphis is just how few decisions they have to make. This is a team that doesn't have a ton of free agents. They, because they're over the cap and already used their biannual exception last year, they don't have the BAE to use. And they don't have any even rookie scale options to decide because their 2016 pick, Wade Baldwin, they declined his third-year option, so he's in Portland now. And their 2017 pick went to Cleveland due to a trade from a while back that involved Maurice Spates and Wayne Ellington, if memory serves. And so they just, the biggest things that they need to do, obviously they have the number 4 pick, so that is a massive decision that they need to make. They can have negotiations on their veteran players depending on what ownership and management wants to do there. But really, it's, I guess, seeing if there's a market for any of their players and kind of lining up the pieces for reconciling whether they want to win now or they want to think more into the future and what defining into the future, because they're not getting much flexibility next year either.
No, they definitely aren't. As of now, including that 4th pick, they already have 13 roster slots taken up, including Andrew Harrison and Wayne Selden. I'm assuming that Amari Johnson, who they signed at the very end of the year, probably won't stick around. Kobe Simmons has a 2-year two-way contract, so he'll be back on a two-way next year, presumably, unless they decide to elevate him. But they're going to hold on to Andrew Harrison. They're going to hold on to Wayne Selden, presumably. I mean, those are guys who are in the rotation. It might even be good rotation players for them next year. They're making the minimum. So that's 13 spots already. They've also got Marshawn Brooks under contract this year, and that is actually guaranteed, but Brooks was awesome. He had like a 26 PER, and this is a team that actually could really use his skill set, especially if Tyreke Evans moves on. And so with those 13 guys under contract right now, they are $10 million short of the tax, and it seems very unlikely, especially with the amount of money that Robert Parra just had to shell out to buy off Steve Kaplan and Daniel Strauss, that they will be going into the tax, especially for a team that, was not very good last year. So they got about $10 million to work with. They have the full mid-level exception available. That's about $8.5 million. But that's probably going to be a little rough if you use all that unless you can get off of some other money, because then you've basically got $1.5 million before the tax, and that's probably not enough room. Maybe you could see them trying to move Jarrell Martin, Ben McLemore. That's pretty toxic, but they don't really have any assets with which to move these guys unless you're going to talk about potentially second rounders. So it's going to be tough for them to get more money. So I do not foresee them using the full mid-level exception.
It also gets complicated because Tyreke Evans signing a 1-year BAE deal, that means that the Grizzlies only have non-bird rights on him. And this is paralleling what the Celtics are going through with Aaron Baines. So if Evans wants more than about $4 million, it's 3.9 technically, they have to use the mid-level exception. I think that will be a kind of a poor use of assets unless you think Memphis is closer to contention, even just the playoff picture next year, than I do, especially because it's so dependent on health of guys that are now getting much older. So if they do that, basically Tyreke is their summer, that in the draft picks. They have 4 and 32. So if they go in a different direction with that spot, I mean, you could kind of go for not a high end, obviously, restricted free agent, maybe somebody like Travion Graham, Doug McDermott, Kyle Anderson, somebody maybe in that mold, who the idea being that you could get them on a contract. You could even maybe front load it a little bit so that it's manageable when this team is a little bit younger. And so maybe those guys move into contracts that aren't as onerous. Outside of that, it gets to be a challenge because the player, I think the biggest need that they have is a swingman who can ideally create a little bit, assuming they don't get Doncic, and defend at least competently. And you're not going to get a guy like that even for the full mid-level.
No, it doesn't seem so. And Chandler Parsons, obviously, is, if they can get something off the bench from him, that'd be nice. They were getting something for him when they were playing well early in the season, but then, of course, the knees started to bother him again, and he played little down the end.
Oh, that's a good point I'd like to bring up just to get people's minds around this. So this is just straight remaining money. And this assumes that all these guys pick up options. Conley has an ETO. Gasol has a player option. So Conley, 3 more years, total of $98 million. Marc Gasol, 2 years, about $50 million. Chandler Parsons, 2 years, about $49 million. So that's $78 million tied up in those three players for next season. A little bit more than that the following year because of raises. And then Gasol, Parsons drop off, Conley stays on.
Also worth noting that Marc Gasol actually has a player option that he could decline for next summer. That's $26 million. Guessing he probably would opt into that if it's purely a financial consideration, but maybe it won't be. And that could also maybe lead to them trading him if he says that he's not going to stick around. We'll see. He certainly has expressed plenty of frustration with the team. I want to talk about his trade value momentarily if they do. I mean, they're not going to trade him this summer, so maybe that's outside the scope of this, so we don't have to talk about that much. I think basically, unless they can clear some money, which again, it doesn't seem likely that they could do. I mean, that 32 pick is pretty juicy. Maybe they would move that, seeing as they have a relatively full roster and they have this number one pick coming in already. I would prefer using that number 32 pick, obviously, to bring in some more young talent. But they have a lot of kind of lower end rotation guys who are on minimum salaries already. So maybe you could say, hey, if we could get off of Ben McLemore, we give up that number 32 pick. McLemore making 5.5 this million. That was or this year. That was a pretty rough signing, basically 2 years, $10.5 million. Although not one that we hated at the time. He seemed like a decent second draft guy there. And he was set back by the broken foot earlier in the year. But let's say they don't move any salary. I mentioned they've got that $10 million or so to work with. Probably can't go the full mid-level exception because they'll just be too close to the tax. They just won't have operating. So I'm going to say maybe the most that they could offer Tyreke Evans would be starting at $6.5 million. Do you think there's any chance he would take that? And they could push out the number of years or give him player option or whatever. But I mean, is that just as a starting salary and whatever permutation he might want? Is that even close to the ballpark for him? Or is he going to have multiple offers for the full mid-level exception that he's going to go with instead in a more competitive area or a more competitive team, I should say?
I think he'll want the full mid-level somewhere else, but I'm not sure that'll be available. I think they're in the ballpark, but the problem for Memphis is that they're probably not going to be super competitive. So he was there for a year. I don't know how this year went for him. I haven't heard any definitive reporting on that.
He played great.
He did. But whether he was happy, the team was awful for a lot of the year. So I could see him taking similar money somewhere else just because, maybe a greater chance of winning. And you can make the argument that, Memphis, if they're healthy, they could be more competitive. But that's such a huge if at this point.
And you'll recall they didn't trade him. So with the idea being that they could try to re-sign him. So I imagine they will make whatever offer they feel like they can make to him. But
sure. I think they're going to offer more than 6.5. I think they're going to offer more around. Maybe they push the limit harder on him than they would on other guys. So maybe they offer him 8, and then if they don't get him, then nobody else gets more than 6. That might be the way that they handle it. And
what do you mean nobody else gets more than 6? I mean,
let's say they offer him 8, and if he says no, then they wouldn't use the full mid-level exception on anybody else for the full value. Yeah. They wouldn't have the option of doing both things, but it's just that basically that the rules don't apply the same way to Tyreke Evans that they do to other guys, partially because they didn't trade him, partially because he did a lot of good last year. Not necessarily good that helped the team, but certainly good nonetheless. And something that I was wondering about with Memphis, it's kind of a gamble. If they have a strong feel on which of their young guys they like better, about whether any of those guys would get claimed on waivers, because that would be another way for them to add a little bit of flexibility. They could even not do it through a waiver claim, just see if a team like the Bulls or something else later on in the process just said, hey, we'll probably have a roster spot in August, and we're interested in Jarrell Martin or something like that.
That seems unlikely.
They just... But just somebody, one of those guys.
Well, but if
Davis,
the guy
whoever it is.
Generally, if a guy is good enough to get claimed, he's not going to get waived. And it's not like I would understand if they had their BAE available and they felt like they had a roster crunch. But yeah, I mean, like Ivan Rabb would be someone. I think pretty much everyone else to me. And remember, they don't. That's their other big need right now is backup big. I mean, maybe what they end up doing is just playing JaMychal Green at backup center some too. But I agree. I mean, I think Martin or Rabb would be the two that I would be most eager to move on from outside of Macklin.
My guess is that they end up drafting a center, so that would resolve that issue.
Really? Well, I mean, they are projected to get Doncic right now, right?
Well, it depends on how people see the. Well, so one of the big issues with Memphis, they've been linked to Doncic before, is that I think they would like Doncic and they would love for him to fall.
Go, huh?
A, he might not want to go, and B, they don't have the assets to move up. So like, because they have basically no assets. They have, that 32 pick. They owe this future pick to Boston, which is top 8 protected next year, top 6 protected in 2020, and then unprotected in 2021. So that means not only do they have to deal with that, but also the Stepien rule building off of that. So like, I don't think they can jump up to 2 or 3 if they really want Doncic either way. So my guess is that even if they don't want him, that like, let's say Atlanta, unless Atlanta is smitten with whoever Sacramento doesn't take, let's say they don't take Doncic, I would expect that they would move down with like Dallas or somebody else and just get somebody else.
Well, they damn well better hope that Doncic is there, because if not, then they would have to draft a center, most likely. And maybe Bagley would be there, and you could say we'll play him at the 4 next to Marc Gasol. But this, again, I mean, is where we've been criticizing them for a while of like, all right, they should have tried to trade Gasol last year. They should have just really embraced the rebuild instead of just like, oh, no, we can get back to 35 wins this year if we keep everyone around. And now with Gasol, what is he, 34 this year? Like now are you going to, part of the hope is like, oh yeah, we can draft this player who, rookies rarely help, but maybe if it's a shot creator, he might be able to help Memphis. But are we going to not draft a center now because we already have Marc Gasol? Are you going to draft the center and then Marc Gasol is like, well, where the hell is the help at? Like, now I want to leave. It's just this idea that they're still trying to win now could really complicate things for them in the draft. And if Doncic is gone, you're looking at Jaren Jackson or Bagley. One of those 2 guys presumably will be there if Doncic is gone. Bagley, I think they could get away with drafting more, with the idea that, he can play next to Gasol. Don't particularly care for that defensive front court early on, but, Bamba, again, is another guy in that range, is being talked about potentially, another guy who's a center. And then really, Wendell Carter is projected number 6 right now by ESPN. So then you would have to, in theory, reach for a Trae Young or a Michael Porter, or try and trade down potentially if Doncic is gone. Maybe you could see them doing that as well, and then try to get, and then Trae Young, same problem. You got Mike Conley already. Maybe what the best option for them would be trying to trade down to get Porter, but that assumes that a team would want to trade up and get a big man for them at 4. The Bulls or something would want to do that. It's the fact that they still have Gasol and all these centers are around, it really does make things a little difficult for them, unless they're just going to, I wouldn't care that I had Gasol. I'd just draft whoever I thought the best player was, but it doesn't seem like they are necessarily going to be thinking.
I am deeply concerned that Memphis is going to interpret this as a lost season that was not reflective of where they're going, and so they will bring back Tyreke, use most of their available resources for that. And, the draft pick will be what it is.
I think that's fine.
Well, I just think that if it's not as catastrophic as what happened in Charlotte with Kemba and just...
He'll be tradable on that contract too, but if they could get whatever contract they sign him to, unless he just gets injured again.
Unless he gets hurt, yeah. And so if they go in that direction, and so really what then it is a lost year in terms of building assets for the next team. And that's not sexy because if they, once they kind of sell off, it's going to take a long time with their current asset base. This number 4 pick is going to have to be awesome for them to work out. And the other reason why I'm concerned about that is because then you get into the circumstance where they're still not good enough to make the playoffs for me unless the West has a lot of injuries or they really exceed expectations. Dylan Brooks, I liked what he did. We talked about him pretty recently because we did their young guys recently. I don't think, he's a starter on a playoff team or anything close to that. So then you're sitting there in January, February going, well, crap, we've already won a bunch of games, more games than the awful teams, and probably can't tank into the bottom, and their pick is top 8 protected. So maybe it's maybe you get another pick that's in the 6 to 8 range. Maybe you lose that pick. And I just feel like I'm going to end up dissatisfied with what they do. I hope that I'm wrong because I want every team to be well managed and everything like that. I just have a sinking feeling with them, not as immediate and visceral as I did with the Knicks in 2016, but kind of like that.
I root for teams to be badly managed, so we have stuff to talk about. No, I'm just kidding. I agree with you.
We always have stuff to talk about.
It can be very frustrating. So, and that Boston pick top 8 protected this year, then goes down to top 6, and then unprotected in 2021. So maybe they would feel like, hey, we got to at least just get rid of this obligation. And at least one good thing, too, is if potentially they jump into the top 4, they wouldn't lose that necessarily either this year or next year. And they still, with the flattened lottery odds, if they do end up with the 10th best record or something, you're not as in as bad a shape as far as trying to get into the top 4 as you would have been previously. What else do we have to talk about with these guys? We can wrap this up pretty soon.
As a technical matter, Jarrell Martin is extension eligible. Remember that he was nearly off this team in September of last year. There was speculation that he wasn't going to make it out of training camp. They ended up cutting Zagorich and somebody else who I can't remember. Deontay Davis is technically extension eligible as well because it's, second anniversary of a 3-year contract. And I don't expect either one of those guys to get extended at all. And just to clarify it a little bit, they wouldn't really have much space in 2019 unless they move Conley or Gasol opts out. They're more of like a 2020 or 2021 team. And I could see, depending on how that shakes out and depending on how well the number 4 pick works out, them at that point being not really good enough to spend, kind of like where Atlanta is this year. And so using that money to extract a little bit more assets, wait a year or two. But that's looking far out. So I'm very intrigued to see how they approach where they are right now.
We could talk briefly, too, if Evans does not return. They definitely need like one more shot creator on this team, especially, of course, with Parsons. Such a question mark. I do think that Evans will probably have better offers because, as we've talked about before, if you're looking for that kind of shot creator guy, either second unit or first unit, there really aren't too many of those guys, right? There's Dwayne Wade, who's said today that if he does return, he hasn't decided on retirement yet, but he would like to come back to Miami. You've got Jamal Crawford. You've got Evans. Maybe Rudy Gay if he becomes available. A little bit different type of player, but still a guy who can create some shots for you. And that's really about it, right? As far as guys who are... And Isaiah Thomas would be the other one as a shot creator for the second year. Derrick Rose maybe comes into that category a little bit. So there's not too many of those guys. And Evans, I would probably put him highest on that list out of anybody. And that's why, and there are a lot of teams that desperately need someone who can create some shots. And Evans had a wonderful year last year. Remains to be seen whether his jump shot is real, to be shooting close to 40% on 3. But outside of those guys, I don't think... Will Barton also is in that category, I'd say. But he's going to be out of Memphis price range. Wayne Ellington might be someone that they could look at, potentially. Joe Harris. But I think they really need... This is such a bad offensive team. They really need someone who can either shoot or create shots, one of the two. Even Mike Beasley could be like an interesting option for these guys, actually.
Yeah, could be.
Ugh. Anyone else who sticks out to you as a possible... if we're talking about $6 million starting salary, or less than that, maybe you could get a couple of guys. Beasley wouldn't command that much, I would imagine.
I could see them being a team if they don't draft a center that could just go after one of the intriguing, young guys, just a flyer on whoever that could be. I think Nerlens will probably be above that, not above that price range, but above what they would want to pay for a backup center. But yeah, in terms of shot creation, it's just such a paltry list. And
Bielitsa, yeah. I'm sure they would love to have if he ends up, he doesn't get a qualifying offer, but I don't know if they have enough money for him either.
I think he would go for a different situation.
Yeah.
That would be my instinct. Unless he thinks that, they could be good. Yeah, and he could start for Memphis, so that would be a sales pitch.
Yeah, JaMychal Green didn't have the greatest year last year. He's their incumbent starting 4 at the moment.
I was toying with the idea, I think he'll get more than this, but of Jeremy Grant there, just because they don't exactly know where the front court is going. And so, Jeremy Grant's a capable player.
I think they got enough kind of athletic guys who can't really shoot at all. That wouldn't be my biggest need. If you can get him on the right deal, sure, I think that's fine. Do you think JaMychal Green could be a trade candidate, potentially? They don't really have any other 4s, though.
I would say he's a negative value on his contract, at least a little bit. He had a rough year, and there are reasons to believe. I had no opposition to his contract when it was signed. I actually thought it was a positive value, so he could turn it around a little bit. But power forwards who aren't necessarily starters are just so...
Yeah. But he could be a switch guy. He's got a little bit of stretch ability. He's like the type of player who maybe, could get some minutes for a playoff team that they might want to trade for. He's just lost so much athleticism, too, which is kind of too bad. But
yeah, and that could also be a way for Memphis to clear, if they needed to for whatever reason. You've talked about why you don't think that's necessary. If they needed to clear a little bit more money, maybe trade him for somebody who makes a little bit less money but is less valuable. I'm sure teams would be happy to do that.
All right, you want to do a little news here?
Yeah, I think the place that we have to start is Dwayne Casey. Casey getting a 5-year deal with the Detroit Pistons. It was a natural fit if Casey wanted to coach this year because the only other option was the team that fired him. So that seems unlikely. And there was some reporting, Palace intrigue about whether Casey was going to have the authority.
Little Caesars Arena intrigue.
Little Caesars Palace intrigue.
They have they are no longer at the Palace of Auburn Hills, but yeah, maybe last summer when they were making the changeover, it could have been a little.
So because of this idea, David Aldridge talked about it, of whether Casey was going to choose his assistants. That might just be kind of semantics.
And then the Pistons got back to him and said, no, actually, we didn't do that. So there's already a leak, presumably coming from Casey's side, I guess, saying that they weren't going to let him choose his assistants. But why, if you're Casey, do you leak if it was him? Maybe it wasn't him, but do you, as you have decided to sign the deal, do you then leak that the reason you did it was because something to make them look bad? It just, maybe he just felt like he wanted to get the upper hand initially, but that doesn't make any sense to me. Why that would get leaked? Maybe it was some assistant that Casey was wanting to bring on that he had contacted that let it get out or something. But that's not good. So that's a shit show. And there are plenty of other shit show aspects to this as well.
Oh, you mean hiring a coach before you hire a general manager?
Yeah, and this Ed Stefanski thing, that he is some great record, we're going to bring him in, and then he's going to bring in Bickerstaff and Jim Lynam. Now, and then, Casey getting a 5-year deal, and they must have really agreed to pay up because remember, he's getting $6 million in theory from Toronto this year. Now that'll be offset. Usually those contracts have offsets in them. So 5-year deal, that's premium. We've seen pretty much every other coach this year get a 4-year deal. Usually those are 4th-year team options. So this might be 5-year deal with a 5th-year team option. But still, he's getting paid that kind of premium coach. And then the other thing that was reported by Aldridge was that the idea that they're going to kind of stick with him through the roster shakeup that has to be coming here. So, I guess if you're going to, and hilarious for Casey too now, right? His whole situation with Ujiri, it seemed like he was hanging on to his job by the skin of his teeth because he predated Ujiri and he was always coaching just well enough to not get fired, even though Ujiri kind of, you would think, wanted to bring in his own guy. And now, the same thing's going to happen again. A GM that he was not chosen by is going to come in. So it's just this whole process just seems to be total madness. And, if we thought the Stan Van Gundy era was bad, this is not a good start at all. Maybe it'll get better. Maybe they'll make some good moves. They haven't. And everyone there, remember, was on board with the Griffin trade, which we hated too. That wasn't just Van Gundy at the time. So I had higher hopes for Arn Tellem if he was going to be one of the main guys involved here. He was such a good agent, but really he's just been kind of doing all just the all old school NBA tried and true. There just is not, I've not been impressed with any aspect of this process. Even just keeping Stan around for a little while, and then it really doesn't.
The other piece of coaching news you brought up, Bernie Bickerstaff, because he is a part of that search committee in Detroit. His son JB is the head coach in Memphis and hired Jerry Stackhouse as an assistant on his team, which is interesting because many kind of fan type people had supported Stackhouse as a candidate for the Toronto job because he has been the head coach of the 905.
Yeah, and he also apparently got a look in Orlando. That, of course, means that he will not be the coach in Toronto. And turning to Toronto briefly, Mark Stein reporting that either Raptors assistant Nick Nurse, who remember coached in Rio Grande Valley with the Rockets organization when they were jacking up all those threes and then was widely credited with some of their offensive reforms, or Spurs assistant Ettore Messina, who of course has that extensive European background as well, are the top 2 contenders supposedly, but that doesn't include others in Toronto. Biggest other news, we had this a couple days ago, I forgot to get to it. Shams Charania on Chris Mannix's podcast for Yahoo said his belief that Kawhi Leonard will be ready to start next season. He says he's close to 100% and he'll be fine going into the year. Now, remember, this is, in some places, has been considered a degenerative condition. It's something that's kind of a wear and tear type of thing. And so it's the type of thing that maybe could regress and is going to have to be managed and stuff. So even if he's feeling good going into next year, that's no guarantee that this whole thing will be in the past necessarily. And then Shams also saying the Spurs have not fielded any trade offers. They still need to have this sit down. The Spurs offering that designated player veteran extension contingent kind of on the results of that. But he did say that Kawhi was around the team. He went to the funeral of Greg Popovich's wife. And I'm sure Greg still is working through a lot of the family issues. So, but presumably this sit down is going to have to happen before we get to July, and who knows whether they'll be reporting on that or not. But if they offer him the extension, I think we'll know what ended up happening there. And then if they don't offer him the extension, then I think, maybe it starts to become open season, or if for some reason he were to reject it. Anything else we got to talk about? Or are we all done here?
I think we're pretty much done. I will have I think there'll be an off-season preview that comes out tomorrow. I don't know exactly who it's going to be yet, but that will come out. And yeah, now that the Pistons are done, I can actually finish that one. So that, and then if you haven't read the piece I wrote on Kevin Durant's options for free agency, that is out at The Athletic. And that's really about it.
All right, thanks for listening. If you didn't listen to our Ayton scouting report and Phoenix Suns, Jared Dudley actually tweeted out that it was a good listen, so that's a good reason to go back and listen to that show. And we'll be back tomorrow with as yet to be determined content. Till then.